my name is Andy Tidy and welcome back to another edition of Life at 2.3 miles an hour. You may have noticed that in the background to several of my videos you can see my workshop, and it probably won't come as any great surprise to you to learn that one of my overriding passions in life is carpentry and woodwork. Now, being practical at carpentry and woodwork is something of an advantage when you're trying to maintain two old boats. They are forever falling to pieces, and over the years I've pretty much refurbished and rebuilt the insides from the bows right through to the stern. But my interest in carpentry doesn't just stop with the things that I make. And so it's true to say that a lot of the tools that I use day in, day out are actually the same tools that I used in my father's workshop when I was learning the trade when I was a teenager. And through those tools I feel a great sense of connection with my past. And so many of the tools that I have actually have something of a backstory that goes with them. And for that reason I would never dream of parting with them, even though I could possibly find better functioning ones in the modern day. Now, just a few weeks ago I was in the fortunate position of being able to absorb a few more tools into my collection, which came from the workshop of my friend Brian. Brian passed away about 12 months ago, and it was with great thankfulness that I was able to buy some of his treasured tools, particularly the wood turning lathe. But as I was collecting the large bits of machinery, they said, "Andy, would you like to have some of his hand tools as well?" And of course I said, "Yeah, I'd love to." And I was picking out a few bits and pieces which I would really enjoy using, and I spied a couple of planes gathering dust up on the top shelf. Now, planes, you're thinking, they must look a bit like this. A modern jack plane, or even one like this, its big brother. Steel cast body, cutting blade, push them along, smooth down the wood. Well, they are certainly planes, but the ones I found didn't look like that at all. And these were the planes that I found. They've got the same cutter blade on them, they seem to be raked at the same angle, but they look completely dissimilar. What's all that about? Well, the modern steel-bodied plane is something of a modern affectation. These were developed for the mass market in the early part of the 20th century, and although they look ubiquitous now, that isn't how planes used to be. For centuries before that, planes did look just like this. In fact, if you go back to the 1450s, you'll find block planes coming out of the mud of the Mary roads that looked almost identical. In fact, if you go back to the times of Rome and to the time when Pompeii was buried in ash, and you dig through the ash, you'll again find smoothing planes almost identical. As long as man has been smoothing wood, they've been using some kind of block plane. Now, I had no great intention of actually using these planes in my day-to-day work. After all, the jack plane does that job just perfectly. What I wanted was to have the planes as something of an ornament and a link to the further past of carpentry. And so I planned to put them on display. And that's exactly what I did. Now, these planes had been inherited by Brian from his father and possibly his grandfather before him, and they therefore were of great sentimental value. But nonetheless, they had probably been standing idle in the dust on the shop top shelf for about 70 years. I duly put the planes up on my top shelf, and every time I came into my workshop I admired the lustre on the side of them. I looked at the patina of age and the scars of use, and I kind of got a warm fuzzy glow about their history. Well, you know what I'm like about history. I started thinking about these planes, and I started to wonder, well, what would they actually be like to use, and how would they compare to its modern day equivalent? Well, one thing led to another, and of course I wanted to know where they were made, who made them, and when were they made. And of course, you know where this is going, don't you? I'm inviting you to crawl down the rabbit hole of history, to go and try to get behind the scenes of this plane and to work out its origins. Well, it turns out that what I have are a pair of 8-inch jack planes. One of them like this, bearing the scars of heavy use for many, many years. And this, the other one, which is in much better condition, but basically the same plane. Now, the thing that attracted me to research the history of this particular plane, which is very beautiful, I must have to say, was the fact that stamped here onto the reverse there is a maker's name. It says Mr. J. Morris. So where better to start than to seek out the help of my friend Mr. Google. But on this occasion, Google didn't actually help me very much. Google told me that there was a Norris & Co. of London who were quite famous toolmakers. But it was Norris, definitely not Morris, as shown on the back of this plane. What I did discover from my research is that making plane bodies was something of an artisan craft. There were some major manufacturers, but mostly these were made by local craftsmen, sometimes even the blacksmiths who forged the blades. Most times though, they were a local producer, sometimes even the artisan himself. Truth be told, you know, when I look at these block planes, with a bit of practice and a bit of patience, I reckon I could probably make a pretty effective block plane body myself. So the trail of Mr. J. Morris went distinctly cold. Well, if I can't track down who made the body of the plane, maybe I can track down something about the manufacturer of the business end, and I mean the steel bits, the blade and the chip cutter. Now, you need to know that these planes don't get together in quite the same way that modern planes do. The blade is held in with simply a wedge-shaped piece of wood. And with the wedge removed, you can remove the blade. And if you look closely here on the blade and on the chip breaker, there is a stamp. The stamp is a bit indistinct, but it says in here it was made in Sheffield. Now, Sheffield is good because Sheffield is the steel capital of Britain. And it says on here something that looks like Ames Howard. Well, I did a search for Ames Howard and I didn't come up with anything. But I did realise that there was James Howarth. It's just that the James and the H at the end of Howarth has been overstamped with the place of manufacture. So this was made by James Howarth. And there's a little logo of the combination of those two initials with an arrow pointing upwards above. So that was something to go on. Well, James Howarth was born in 1811. And he went on to become something of a celebrity toolmaker, not just in Sheffield where he was born, or even in Britain. He actually ended up exporting thousands and thousands of his edged tools around the world. And we know he did well because we find records of James Howarth exhibiting at the great exhibitions of 1851 and 1862. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the great exhibitions of the Victorian era, these weren't 3 or 5 day events that we would recognise at the NEC today. These were 4, 5 or 6 month long exhibitions which pulled together the greatest and the best of Britain. And they were run in London, and they would run over the summer months from May till about September. The first one was held in Hyde Park. The second one was held in South Kensington, under what is now the National Science Museum. And not only did James Howarth attend these exhibitions and display at them, he also won the coveted gold medallion at both events. And so his reputation grew. And in due course, his sons joined the business and it became James Howarth and Sons. And this expansion of the business is actually quite crucial in trying to date this plane. And so we now know we have a window of 1879 to 1922 when this blade was made, and probably when the body was made as well. And so, having spent time down the rabbit hole of history discovering the origins of this plane, I thought, what would it be like to actually use it, and how would it measure up against its modern day equivalent? And that's what I want to share with you. And truth be told, I don't know what the outcome of this is going to be, but I would invite you to join me on this journey of discovery. Well, I guess the first question we have about this block plane is it an entity? I mean, do all the constituent elements belong to this plane, or have they been changed over the years? Well, a cursory look at it would suggest that this wedge is contemporary to the wood used on the body, so it would appear to be the same plane without any adaptations. Secondly, do the light marks on the prongs, do they correspond to where it fits inside the body? And they do exactly. And the light sections are where the light has never got at the woodwork. The next test is these prongs, actually called fingers. Are they intact? Are they the same length? And are they the same angle? Well, I would say yes, they are perfectly identical and they are completely intact. In fact, I can't see that this wedge has been removed in decades. Then next, removing the iron, is the throat inside smooth and in good condition? And what you have is a flat surface for the steel to rest on and a hollow for the screw mechanism to be recessed into. And in this instance, it all appears perfectly smooth and totally clean. Now the next question is the blade contemporaneous with the body? And by that I mean, does it fit into the slot neatly? Well, the answer to that is yes. There's probably about 3 millimeters of play either side, which is just enough to be able to adjust the angle of attack of the blade, but not allowing it to become sloppy. And so if we turn to the sole of this plane, it's clearly been used because there are striations or some small gouges down it, but the throat is intact. There's no evidence along the sides that the body has contracted around the blade and called blown cheeks, so there's no problem there. I would expect to see a little bit of a wear on the toe and on the heel. That's normal for a plane that's been used. So we'll just have a look and see how much. Well, the heel is level and the toe maybe 1.5 millimeters of wear, but for a wooden plane that's not very much. So all in all, we have a body and we have a wedge which appear to be made exactly the same time. We have a blade which was made sometime in the late 1800s, which fits into the slot neatly, and a wedge which holds it in nice and comfortably. I think what we have is a good example of an old block plane which has had very little wear over the years. In comparison, take a brief look at this, its brother. This one has got signs of massive wear around the sides. Now if we want to work out how much wear a plane has had, it's a good idea to have a look at the steel blade. If I look at the plane that I want to try and work with, you'll see there's probably 2 inches of bare steel ready and waiting to be used. But if I take the blade out of the other plane, you'll see there is probably half of it being ground away in repeated sharpening sessions. Now, one of the crucial things to getting one of these planes working again is to see if these cheeks still operate. These are the little bits that the wedge jams up against, and these are all perfectly in condition. And in fact, there's quite a lot of nice little detailing work gone into here, so I think this is a high-end plane. Certainly James Howarth & Co were reputed to be the finest edge tool makers in Sheffield and in the UK because they were unstinting in their search for the best quality steelwork that they would use, and also they only employed the very best labour. And there are nice little touches like the chamfering on the top of the chip breaker. So I think we have a top end body made by a local artisan producer and an absolute world beating blade which so far has received very little sharpening. If we're going to find a block plane that stands up against its modern equivalent, this one I think is it. Now, given the quality of this body and its lack of damage, I'm not actually going to do anything to the outside surface. I want to retain the patina of age that goes with this plane, but I am going to make sure that this plane has the best chance it can of working to its optimum capacity. And that means I'm going to smooth the base off just lightly, and I'm going to restore the blades. So let's start with the woodwork end of things. So when it comes to restoring the body, all we really need to do is to make sure that the base is flat. Now, the sole of this plane is in such good condition, it doesn't need to be attacked with a modern plane to really flatten it off. What I'm going to do is take off the residue of the paints and the bits of glue that have accumulated. I'm going to do that on a bit of 240 grit that we've applied here onto a nice flat piece of MDF. As you'll see, although the striations haven't gone away completely, the sole is essentially flat. I certainly haven't even got rid of the original varnish. Now we've sanded the base, you can see that the striations or the scratch marks on the base go around in an arc this way. And that would suggest to me that this was belonged to a right-hand craftsman, because as you plane, the tendency is to move in this sort of arc. So the scratches should start at this corner, go across and then back out again. And that is exactly what we're finding. Now the surface of this plane has acquired a beautiful patina over the ages, and I definitely don't want to lose that, but it has got a certain build-up of filth around the blade. So I'm going to give a light clean to it. And to clean it, I'm just going to use a little bit of methylated spirits and apply it and just wet the area, and then lightly rub it over with a little bit of wire wool. And this should very gently get us down to natural wood. And as you can see from the top, with a little bit of work using some methylated spirits and a little bit of wire wool, you can see the difference. We've got the clean side here and the original side here. You can also see a little bit of that cracking out in the jaws that I mentioned, where the wood has contracted around the side of the blade and pressed it out slightly, but it doesn't go anywhere, so it's not going to do any damage. So I'm going to carry on and I'm going to clear around the other side of the top of this plane. Well, that's as clean as I'm going to go. I'm not going to do any more to this body because I think I'm actually going to detract from it rather than add. Functionally, it's now all there. Cosmetically, well, I'm just going to burnish it and bring it up to its former glory. And for that, a little bit of boiled linseed oil is the way to go. Now the wedge itself has taken a bit of a beating from its use over the years, so I'm going to give that a little bit of a sanding. Well, we've got rid of the worst of the wood chips and the broken bits of wood that were around the around the wedge. It's quite a nicely shaped wedge. It's not just a flat wedge, it's got two different planes on it. It's been made with quite a lot of care. Now I'm spending a little bit more time over the wedge than I did over the body. I'm satisfied that the slot that the plane blade goes into is exactly flat and it's not got any rubbish in it. And if we turn over the back of the wedge, and I've done a light sanding, you can see that although this section at the back is all okay, down here at the tips you've got a fair amount of build-up, and that will be from the resins out of the wood that it's been used to cut. So I'd like to try and get those resins gone so the whole thing lies completely flat again. So I'll do a little bit more work on that. So that's all of the resins and residues that were built up underneath removed. So I'll just give that another coat of boiled linseed oil, and that will bring that back to just the way that Mr. Morris intended it when it first left his workshop. So having finished the plane body, it's now time to move to the business end of the plane, the bit that really makes a difference of whether it's going to cut or not. And by that I mean the steel work. This steel body, and this is the cutting edge, and the bit on the back, which is known as the chip breaker, probably haven't been separated for about 70 years. I don't know how this is going to go. Well, it seems to turn. Well, that all looks in very good condition. The chip breaker has got a nice brass wheel going into a brass recess. It says something on there. I think that's another J. Howarth sign on there. And the plane blade itself, well, as I said, it's got a lot of meat left on it, so there's a lot to cut back. I mean, look at the thickness of this blade. It's nothing like a modern day blade. The back end is maybe 3 millimeters thick, but down here at the cutting edge, it's got to be more like 5. In fact, I'll measure it. Yeah, 5 millimeters thick at the cutting edge. That is a quality bit of steel. And this on the back here is pretty nice and smooth. Not bad for something that was made about 140 years ago. But nonetheless, if we're going to bring this back to life and to test it against its modern equivalent, we need to get it flat and sharp. Now, I don't plan to go through sharpening plane blades in great depth, but if we're going to set this one the task of living up to its modern equivalent, we do at least need to get it prepared. So what I want to do is to make sure that the back of the plane blade is flat and true, so that it lays level. And for that I've laid a piece of 240 grit on top of a very flat surface, which is a piece of plate glass, and I'm just going to clear it up. As we can see that in the light, we've got a flat area across here, flat area down here, definitely flat area along here, and pretty much okay there, but a bit of a depression in that section. Not worried about this back section, that's purely cosmetic. I just want to get this business end sorted out. I'll do a little bit more work on that. Well, we've got the blade pretty well clean. This is the side that faces downwards, and we can see that that's pretty much cleaned up. There's a little bit of corrosion and pitting in there, but basically there's a lot of good steel in there. And then on the other side, the upside, which is where the chip breaker clamps down on it, it's important that it's flat so the whole thing holds together. Well, I can feel there are a few little pits, but there's nothing along the cutting line, so nothing really to worry about. So as far as the blade is concerned, it's cleaned up. The chip breaker, on the other hand, well, you have to be sure that this edge is absolutely flat. And to achieve a flatness, I just lay a piece of glass paper on a flat surface, like a piece of glass, and then just run the chip breaker up and down it. as we can see across this edge, it's a lovely flat shiny edge. It's about 2 mils wide and it's as flat as a pancake. So that chip breaker is going to work a dream when it's located up on top of there. Now, sharpening the edge of the blade, the sloping bit is called the bevel, and normally you try to get that bevel at about 25 degrees and the final bevel to cut at about 30. Now, before we do that, I want to make sure that the blade is square straight across, and we can see that from the accurate set square it is 100% at 90 degrees from side to side, so we don't need to do anything very drastic. All we need to do is to grind off the face, get it to a nice clean surface. This actually looks like it's in good condition. It's got a good primary bevel and a good secondary bevel, although a few little nicks. And the way to get that set up right is to use a gauge. This one is a Veritas gauge, which is a really nice one, comes from Canada, and we use these diamond plates. The diamond plates run down in descending order of grittiness, if you like, or so you start off with your blacks, you go through to your blues and then onto your reds. The good thing about these diamond plates is they are absolutely stable, absolutely flat, and they do the job very quickly. Now, we've got a Veritas bevel setter here and it clamps it in, and I've eyeballed it so that it should come out at about 30 degrees. All I've got to do is run this backwards and forwards over the diamond plates in order to get the thing down nice and flat and level. You can see some metal filings coming off here, and if we look on the back you can see that it's already flattening off, but there is a little bit of a way to go. So I'll persevere and I will come back to you. Well, given the thickness of this plain blade, that actually took quite a long while, but as you can see, we've got a good primary bevel back down there. Okay, it hasn't quite reached the back, but that doesn't matter. We've now got to a point where we can apply the secondary bevel, the sharp. So to do that, we'll slacken off the clamps and we will just pull the blade in and bring it up about 5 degrees. It's more important that this is done so that it's flat and an even bevel than it is getting the exact angles right. Providing the basic angles are right, it's going to cut right. And this section should be quite a lot faster. So just add a little bit of WD-40 to protect the metal that I've just thoroughly soaked. Drop the blade in, feel for it with your finger and make sure it's jolly sharp, and then tap the wedge into place. And I can just feel that sticking out a tiniest bit. That should work. I think actually it's out a little bit too far, so the adjustment is quick tap on the back and it shifts back just a little bit. So let's not get too adventurous here. I've got about a bit of 12mm floorboard, and I'll set it up and we'll see if that cuts. Well, that's possibly a little bit on the thick side, but it's definitely heading in the right direction. Well, how about that? How is that for a thin wafer? And that literally is my first setup. I've not used this before. It hasn't run for 70 years. And as you can see, the piece is paper thin and translucent. And if we compare this to my modern jack plane, we'll need to back that off a bit. Now, I'll admit that the jack plane with its wheel adjustment is somewhat easier than the mallet approach with the old coffin-shaped bench plane, but I reckon I'm getting superior results from my 1800s plane than I am with one built in the 1960s. Well, there you have it. 1800s technology versus 2000s technology. 2000s wins on terms of the usability of it. 1800s definitely wins in terms of the end result. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Life at 2.3 miles an hour. I hope you've enjoyed seeing a little bit about the restoration of an antique bench plane, somewhere between 100 and 140 years old. Not bad for a delayed box opening. And I will see you again soon. Cheerio and happy carpentry.